Hey guys, these are 10 books that I consider mandatory reading. And these are books that I feel are so good or so important that everybody really should understand them, whatever else they do in life. And these are in no particular order, by the way, it's just the order that I put them on the website. If there's any books that you think should be on this list, let me know. Put it in the comments. And the first one on this list is The Peter Principle by Lawrence Peter. Definitely one of my favorite books. I've seen this on other top book recommendations, by the way. The Peter Principle, it's so insightful, it's so simple too. It's basically the fact that in hierarchies, people tend to be promoted beyond their level of competence. That's such a simple statement. It's a small book, but it's completely worth understanding this in more depth. It matters so much for our life. For example, in my life, I know that I'm a better producer than a manager. I want to stay in the lab. That's where I belong. And before I started my business, I actually asked a friend of mine to be the CEO because I already knew the Peter Principle. I already know that I'm not CEO material. I'm not management material. I don't get personal fulfillment from it, and I'm not very good at it. Now, my friend declined because he knew how big of a responsibility it was. So now that I'm forced to be CEO, I have to try and find ways to get other people who are stronger at management and stronger at public relations to do those things rather than myself. When you first start a business, you probably do a little bit of everything. You might do the ordering and the sales and the recruitment and the taxes, and you might have several hats that you wear at first, but hopefully you get people who are better suited to each role to specialize in those roles. So knowing the Peter Principle, we can avoid promoting people past their level of competence. When we understand the Peter Principle, we can understand why it seems that entire companies and entire organizations can be incompetent from the top down. Well, that's because, as the Peter Principle states, in hierarchies, people tend to be promoted past their level of competence into their level of incompetence. They do a good job as a teacher and they are promoted to principal, but they may or may not be a good principal. The Peter Principle has a follow-up book called The Peter Prescription, but if you understand the Peter Principle, then you can determine for yourself, was I happier as a teacher than I am as a principal? Was I more fulfilled on the sales floor than on the sales management team? Am I better at taking orders or giving orders? Now, the current hustle culture might have you believe that everybody should be the CEO. I don't believe that. I like being a number two. I like being part of a strong team. I like having somebody in the role of leader that is better working with people and so on. People who work with me, they know that if they can't manage themselves, we're probably not going to be a good fit together here. I'm very hands-off. The reason I'm hands-off is because I understand the Peter Principle and I understand my place, and I don't want to promote myself beyond my level of competence, because at your level of competence, that's also your level of satisfaction. That is where you're going to be able to express yourself to your fullest, most natural capacity. And in many cases, there's more money for being promoted up, but it doesn't seem to be worth it if it makes you less happy. But I believe we could also make more money at our level of competence. If you're a better salesperson than in management, you can make millions and millions of dollars in sales. You can make millions and millions of dollars as a producer. You don't have to own the record company. And you might do a better job as a producer than you would as the CEO. So I recommend the Peter Principle and the Peter Prescription, but the Peter Principle is much more important. Next on my list here is The Richest Man in Babylon. Also one of my absolute favorite books. It makes financial literacy so simple. I was very poor for most of my life, by the way. I turned it around, and one of the things that I did was listen to The Richest Man in Babylon on repeat on audiobook, read it multiple times as well, and when I finally implemented the rules of gold, my financial life totally changed and it's remained better. Now, this book is a fiction, but it's actually a realistic fiction. It uses stories and fictional characters back in the times of Babylon to illustrate financial problems, financial complaints, objections, and what to do about them in ancient terms, but that completely apply to the modern world because it is a modern book. I bet you'll see yourself in some of the characters, and I do hope that the laws of gold do seep in and that you do apply those things, because again, they can change your life, and other books that are on this list repeat a lot of the same things that are in The Richest Man in Babylon. I don't usually like stories very much, but The Richest Man in Babylon is just so good that I consider it a non-fiction book, actually. And it's not a huge book. I wish I had read it and studied it and internalized it and applied it 15 years before I did. So it's never too late to get a hold of your financial life, and I recommend starting with The Richest Man in Babylon. Next on this list, I've also got another tiny book here. These have all been small books so far. Lying by Sam Harris. Now, Sam Harris is one of my favorite authors, actually. I disagree with him about many political things. He's a well-known atheist. I don't agree with that. But there's few people that I disagree with so much and yet am so inspired by. And I've been a fan of Sam Harris for many years, in part because of this book, Lying, and actually another book that I've got later on the list here, Free Will. They're both small books. They're both very important and very specific little subjects. That little book about lying hopefully will convince you that lying is not worth it. And there's some common objections to that, you know. So do I tell my wife she looks fat if she asks me and I honestly believe she looks fat? Lying covers those types of conversations, and I totally agree with him. Life is better with a policy of honesty. There's no webs of deception that I can get caught in or anything, and I can focus myself on just doing what I do instead of covering my tracks or remembering the lies that I told. So lying is very worth it. Free Will, I think, is even better, actually. Free Will has been one of my favorite books for a very long time. Again, such a small book, so profound to me. We actually have thoughts before we're conscious of them. That's the basis of this free will argument, that we're not actually the author of our thoughts. We are the recipients of our thoughts. Very profound concept to me. I think it connects with Rupert Sheldrake's work, by the way. And I don't have any Rupert Sheldrake books on this mandatory reading list, but I highly recommend all of Rupert Sheldrake's books. And if you understand his theory of morphic resonance and morphic fields, then I assume that you'll see that free will is us being an antenna and picking up the thoughts that we are then conscious of after we receive them. Very interesting. And every time I bring it up, I want to talk a whole lot about it. So I'm going to cut myself off there and just highly recommend both of those two books. And actually, there's a third book by Sam Harris that is not on this list, but is also worth it. The Moral Landscape. It's one of my favorite books too. It's a lot longer. It's a lot less succinct and beautiful than Lying or Free Will. But on its own as a regular book, it's very good, I think. I think it lays out quite a good, reasonable explanation of why we don't need religion for morality. And I'm not an atheist, but I'm also not a Christian or anything like that. I don't have a religion. So I agree with him. I agree that we can establish our moral foundations, our values on an objective framework. And that's what The Moral Landscape is all about. Really, really recommend it. Next here, we've got a health book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Dr. Weston A. Price. One of the most famous nutrition books out there. It was written almost 100 years ago. It existed before the age of supplements and before the age of a lot of the confusing science and the confusing research. We can get lost in a sea of research. What Weston Price did is he went around the world and found a bunch of primitive people in all types of different environments who were either not in contact with flour and sugar, the white man's powders, processed foods, or they were just beginning to be in contact with it, and even some groups that only some people ate those traded foods and other people remained on the native diet. It showed the extreme difference in the health of the people who did not eat those powders and people who did. Weston Price was a dentist, so he was looking at the cause of cavities, and he found it. It's the processed foods. People who ate the processed foods had dental problems, but he also noticed and connected it to health problems. He noticed that the people he found without cavities and without teeth problems didn't have other problems invariably. A lot of these places never had diseases that plague us today. And of course, he noticed people with messed up teeth also had messed up health in general. Very, very important. Lots of photographs, very clearly written. I consider it essential reading for people who are in the health business, people who are interested in health in general. And if you just want to know how to live properly, we know that processed foods screw us up in a multitude of ways. That was proven 100 years ago. And if we understand that, we might actually do it. We might actually avoid processed foods in our modern environment, and we will be better off as a result. Final reason I like this book, by the way, is because Weston Price didn't like supplements. He didn't like the idea of supplements, and I'm in the supplement business. So I actually like using his book because to me, his book makes a great case for why we should supplement. He was working 100 years ago when there was still more nutrients in our food, and even then he knew soil depletion was a big problem. So I think he was a little bit too hasty in writing off supplements. And I like that if I do recommend it, it doesn't feel like supplement propaganda, right? He's allowing you to understand these things on a much more foundational level, and you can do your own math and decide how you're going to get your nutrients, if you're going to try and get it from food or if you're going to take supplements. Next, I've got a book that I added on here recently, actually, this year. It's called The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Firstenberg. This has become quite a popular book, actually. It's about radiation. It's about the history of electricity and EMF, electromagnetic frequencies. This is very, very important for health. Nutrients are important. Foods are important. But EMF can screw us up so much that it doesn't even matter what our nutrition is. Got a very interesting history. Quite a big book here. I disagree with him about a couple of technical things, by the way, but it's still absolutely worth reading this book. Everybody should understand the extent of the problem of EMF and how far back the evidence goes of human harm or biological impairments This has been recorded since the beginning of the history of electricity. I've read a whole bunch of books about EMF, and I did not know a lot of that stuff. Very well written, very clear. And by the way, it also connects to what a lot of other people are saying these days about terrain theory. A lot of people are saying that viruses don't exist. We're not going to talk about that right now. But Furstenberg is one of the many people who are connecting plagues and outbreaks of viruses to EMF. And that's what the whole first part of the book is about, actually. So again, a lot of information, very, very worth it. Everybody needs to understand this, or our modern world actually will kill us eventually, in my opinion, if we don't turn the problem around. Next, I've got another health book here. This is the case against fluoride. Now, I don't personally think that fluoride is one of the biggest problems in the world. Consuming fluoride isn't great. In my opinion, it is toxic, I agree, sure. But I don't think it's the largest problem. I do think that soil depletion and nutrient deficiencies and processed foods and EMF, I think those are bigger problems. But fluoride is a very interesting case because it's the first massive case of sidestepping medical freedoms in America, Canada, Australia. Any country with a constitution that protects your medical freedoms, the addition of fluoride has breached your rights. Chlorine is not put in tap water for a medical purpose. It's put in there to kill bacteria. Fluoride is put in supposedly for our teeth. So that's a medical purpose. That's a treatment. Anytime you use something to treat a medical problem, it's now called a drug. So fluoride is a drug because it's being used to treat a medical problem called tooth decay, and they're treating it randomly, giving everyone the same dose, right? A 2-pound infant or a 200-pound man, they're all being given the exact same dose. Well, of course, nutrients and drugs should be dosed on body weight, so this random dosing hits the lighter weight people a lot harder. And that's one reason why you're supposed to get an actual prescription for a drug. You are supposed to agree to a treatment with your informed consent. Your physician is supposed to give you information so that you can make an informed decision on what to put in your body or not for a health problem. And it's also your decision if you don't want to do anything about it. Especially for tooth decay, there's no law that says you have to brush your teeth. You can pull all your teeth out and wear dentures if you feel like it. But in this case, the government has superseded our rights to informed consent on a medicine and added fluoride, the drug, into tap water. It's very important, whether you believe fluoride is good for you or not. I don't believe it's good for you. The book does a good job of making that case as well. But you absolutely must understand the importance of your medical rights and freedoms, because at this point, there is now nothing stopping them from putting other drugs into our bodies, food, tap water, whatever, without our consent, for our own good. This book gives you a very good outline of the political and the health nature of this problem. Next is a relatively big book here called Debt, The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, one of my favorite authors. Unfortunately, he died way before his time in 2020. Very big shame, but he left us with some incredible books, including Debt. This is one of the most profound descriptions of the history of money, the history of credit, the history of debt. Very important for how we understand how humans actually get along with each other out there in the wild in the absence of centralized currencies. Like, what do humans do without money? It goes into great detail on the myth of barter. The idea that if we didn't have government money and all this stuff, that we would be reduced to bartering and we wouldn't be able to run an economy off of bartering. Well, Graeber does such a good job of outlining why that isn't even a real concern, because natural, primitive, free people don't barter. They do a little bit of barter, but their economies generally run on forms of ad hoc credit. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, read this book. It's one of those books that I like to reread actually every year or two. And by the way, I also like to reread The Peter Principle and Lying and Free Will every year or two. Now, Graeber has such layered thinking and layered writing that every time you read him, you find something new. He has these big, long run-on sentences, and they can be confusing even. I find myself having to reread a lot of sentences and paragraphs because they can be quite convoluted, but I think he's brilliant, or was brilliant. There's so much insight hidden in those little layers and in those run-on sentences that I could return to them again and again and find new ideas in, or find new clarity on these ideas, because debt isn't just about one idea, it's about multiple. And I love some of his other books, by the way. I just wouldn't put them really on the mandatory list. Like, everybody should understand debt, the history, the relevance. David Graeber calls himself an anarchist anthropologist, so he believes in no government and he studies populations. That's what anthropologists do. So he has a ton of insights into the social relation part of this. It's just, I find it so interesting. I've read other histories of money and credit that were really dull and not at all as interesting as the social insights that Graeber adds. I recommend all of his other books actually. Top of the list are The Utopia of Rules. That might even be his best book, but it's not as important as Debt. The book BS Jobs might be his most well-known book, and I thought it was great, but those other two are better, Debt and The Utopia of Rules. And it's worth reading everything he wrote because I do think he was one of the best thinkers and writers of our generation. I'm gonna try and speed up here a little bit. Next book is called The Friendship Factor. Now, I actually only read this book once. I loved it so much that I put it on the mandatory list. I read a ton of books in the personal development category, and a lot of them are good, but not great. And I just felt that this one was great. I really don't even want to explain it. I just feel that if you read this book, it should make you a better person in your relationships, maybe even with yourself, without other people. Hard to even describe it because I don't think there was any one point in the book that really made me see things differently, but many of them. So I highly recommend it. Next is Crushing It by Gary Vee. Now the reason this is mandatory is because we're in the year 2022 right now. We're never going back to a world without social media, without internet. Hopefully, that would probably be a dark ages. And now that we do have the internet, everybody has to understand the opportunities that's available to us now. I make my living on Instagram, not even on YouTube. 2 of my YouTube channels are monetized, but it's minor compared to the living that I make on Instagram. People don't understand how to convert attention into money, into a business, a real business. They don't understand the possibilities that are available. Now, you might not be the person who wants to do a YouTube channel or an Instagram account or quit your job. You know, maybe you're happy with your job. You still need to understand this. Maybe you have kids. Maybe they're going to want to do this instead of the jobs that may or may not be available for them in the future. And maybe you don't want to be the entrepreneur, maybe you don't want to be the influencer, but maybe you just knowing a little bit about this will help your daughter, nephew, brother, somebody do this. Maybe you want to work with them, right? We talked about the Peter Principle earlier. Maybe you don't want to be the guy or the woman on camera. Maybe you don't want to be the head honcho. Maybe you don't want to be the center of attention. Maybe you can work with somebody who does, though. You're not going to be able to do that unless you understand the Crushing It thing, the Crushing It message. It's a formula that really works. It's an opportunity that people don't understand in general. And if you do already do social media and you haven't read this book, I don't know what you're doing. People who are doing social media professionally have read this book. They know this book. Maybe you didn't even know you wanted to be in business. Maybe you didn't even know that you have something, a skill, a knowledge set in your life right now that you could monetize. Maybe you didn't even know that was a possibility. Maybe you can do something like that spare time. Who knows? Maybe you get the inspiration if you read that book. Okay guys, that was 10 mandatory books. Make sure to check out this video next. I appreciate you. Until next time.